Hi guys. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, let's I'll just wait a minute and see if anyone else comes. What time is it now? I think I've got 1 minute. I don't want to jump start. Okay, so I guess I might as well get started. Today, I wanted to carry on talking about Hegel, finish off Hegel, and we're going to move on to John Stuart Mill. We're slightly behind, but hopefully we won't end up that behind. And I wanted to start off by talking about why I thought it was sort of appropriate to put Mill together with Hegel, and what I think the connection is. And it's going to turn out that at the beginning of Mill, I think there's a sort of connection to Hegel, but Mill's sort of defense of paganism, there's a sort of defense of paganism in Mill, I think connects with Nietzsche. So there's both Hegelian elements and Nietzschean elements in Mill, I think. So in this class, we're just looking at quite a limited bit of Hegel. We're looking at the introduction and the preface to the philosophy of right. And last class, we looked at section number 5. Yep, so let me remind you what we were looking at. So we looked at section number 5, where Hegel talks about the will as purely indeterminate, as infinite, as universal, as abstract. And there's a whole bunch of ways he characterizes the will understood in these terms. Yeah, so you have the notion of the infinite, the universal, the indeterminate, the abstract. And then opposed to that, in number 6, we're going to get this conception of the will as determinate, as finite, as particular, as limited, and the like. And Hegel's point is that he thinks both of these ways of thinking about the will as potential as opposed to actual, the will as infinite as opposed to finite, the will as universal as opposed to particular, the will as subjective as opposed to objective. Both ways of thinking about the will in this sense are one-sided. They're both sort of abstractions. Yeah. Now, we might think that one of them is basic. And so I think the sort of Kantians and the Romantics took this first notion of the will as foundational. First of all, it's potential, then it becomes actual. Yeah, that the will as infinite is prior to the will as finite. The will as indeterminate is prior to the will as determinate. And this is the idea that Hegel wants to reject. Hegel wants to reject the idea that this first notion of the will, or the second notion, are in some sense primary. And instead, he's going to suggest that both the will understood in terms of pure indeterminacy in this first moment, and the will understood in terms of this second moment, sort of mutually are both abstractions. We've got two abstract ways of thinking about the will. The will is universal, the will is particular. Both of these ways of thinking about ourselves are abstractions. And there's this third moment, the will as sort of concrete, that sort of tries to overcome these dichotomies. Now, the book itself is then divided into three sections: abstract right, morality, and ethical life. And each of these three sections is divided up into three sections. And then each of the sections is divided up into three, it just goes on forever, yeah, until you end up where you started, yeah. But the three main parts of the book, the first part is about abstract right, the second part about morality, the third about ethical life. They sort of mirror this. So abstract right starts off with the idea as the law is determinate, as objective, as outside. And the idea of abstract right is, to make sense of abstract right, you need some idea of morality. You need some idea of subjectivity. Why? Because in order to have a system of abstract right, ultimately you need a legal system, and within the legal system, you need impartial judges. So the idea of abstract right sort of pushes you towards the idea of morality, yeah? So the idea of abstract right by itself is insufficient, because abstract right as a practice requires or presupposes some sort of legal system, and a legal system involves impartial judges. And so the idea of abstract right sort of presupposes or pushes you into the idea of an impartial judge. Yeah, and we might think the idea of impartial judgment is the idea of morality. This is the idea of Kantian morality. But the idea of morality for Hegel is itself one-sided. And the idea of the morals of morality, at least to begin with, is the idea of a certain type of pure subjectivity. Yeah, the idea of morality, at least as the kind of Kantian starting point, involves this first element of the will, the element of pure indeterminacy, the idea of absolute abstraction and universality. Yeah, think about Kant's account of morality involving the idea of giving universal law, of universalizability. Yeah, so the idea of universalizability is tied to this idea of the will as limitless, as absolute abstraction. Yeah, and so in the section on morality, so this is part 2. And this wasn't on the reading, but I'm just setting it up. So he says the moral point of view is the point of view of the will insofar as the latter is infinite, not only in itself, but for itself. Now this is going to be, it's got to do with determining the person as a subject. Yeah, and the discussion of the discussion of morality, he starts off with the idea that morality, in some sense, starts off with the idea of subjectivity. So we might think of abstract right as something like law and right as objective. Morality puts subjectivity first. And the kind of culmination of the idea of morality is the idea of conscience, yeah, the inner court of conscience. Each individual as their own judge, each individual conscience as an individual who is capable of making this judgment. And so morality is, in a sense, subjective. And this is going to be the limitation of morality. And it's going to turn out that you want, in order to combine morality, right as objective and right as subjective, this can only happen in a sort of what we might think of as a modern liberal society, a society that sort of values and promotes individuality. Yeah, this is a sort of conception of liberalism that I think you get in Hegel, and this is the sort of conception you get in John Rawls in political liberalism, where the political sphere allows people with very different conceptions of the good to live together at peace. Yeah, so we might think morality, in what sense is morality subjective? Well, morality involves judgments of the good, and we have different conceptions of what constitutes a good life. Yeah, and I take it this idea that morality is in a sense subjective, that our judgments about the good differ. This is something we're going to find in Mill and Mill's classical defense of liberalism on liberty. Yeah, and so this idea of the subjectivity of morality, we're not going to read Hegel's chapters on this. We're going to read Mill. But I think in some sense there's a sort of convergence in some way between this Millian idea and the Hegelian idea. So this is a bit perverse, but instead of giving you Hegel's on morality, what I'm going to give you is I'm going to sort of try and give you Hegel with a sort of Hegelian reading of Mill. If you're interested, if you're interested in Kantian ethics, Hegel has a very famous attack on Kantian ethics in the discussion of morality. He thinks Kantian ethics just gives you an empty formalism. The classical Hegelian critique of Kantian ethics, that it doesn't have any content. It's just abstract and empty. And this is the kind of limitation of, and in some sense, he thinks that the content is given by your kind of historical particularity and determinacy. Yeah, it doesn't have any content in itself because this striving for universality is just a kind of this aspect of abstraction. Yeah, so that is why I'm giving you Hegel and Mill together. Where are we? Let's go back to the preface. So, yeah. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong Hegel. Sorry. Yeah. So last class we were looking at this section on the will as pure indeterminacy. The idea of, and it's going to be the idea of, this is going to be tied together with the idea of morality as subjectivity, with the idea of conscience, Kantian universalizability. It's going to be tied with the discussion of freedom as arbitrariness. Yeah, the freedom in number 15. So I want to quickly, we talked about this last time. So number 15. As he's talked about the will in general, we've got these two moments of the abstract and the particular, the indeterminate and the determinate. We've got a similar sort of thing going on in freedom with different conceptions of freedom. And one conception of freedom is the idea of the freedom of the will as a certain type of arbitrariness. Yeah, and this idea of arbitrariness involves the idea of free reflection, which abstracts from everything and depends on an inwardly or externally given content and material. So you've got this freedom of the will as arbitrariness. And on the one hand, you've got this idea of free reflection, which abstracts from everything. Yeah. But at the same time, this capacity to say yes and no depends on an inwardly or externally given content. So the content for judgment, arbitrary judgment, sort of comes from outside. And in some sense, this is going to be Hegel's critique of the idea of freedom as arbitrariness, because the content is sort of given. The content comes from outside the will. And it's going to turn out that real freedom involves rejecting this sort of myth of the given. Real freedom, in some sense, both the content and the form. And that's real freedom is then going to be the idea of self-determination, of the will willing itself. This is kind of the positive conception of freedom. Yeah. Now, I said last time that this notion, so we're on this one, Hegel says there are these two ways of looking at things, and they're both one-sided. And he does this throughout his work, where every bit of Hegel, you're going to get this two-sidedness charge coming up. And normally, once you've seen it done once, you can see it done over and over again, and you have a similar sort of dynamic. So on the one hand, you have this sort of abstraction, indeterminacy. On the other hand, you have something determinate, and it turns out both of them are inadequate. So this idea of freedom as infinite is an idea that I think he's getting from, that goes back to Descartes. And I mentioned this last class. And I know when I teach Descartes, so I think most of you did Descartes with me, I normally skip the fourth meditation. And so I think that I just want to jump back to Descartes and tell you something about Descartes' fourth meditation, because I think the fourth meditation is sort of fun anyway. It's worth knowing about, but also to understand Hegel, it's sort of useful. So in the fourth meditation, Descartes' interested in truth and falsity and error. And he's got this idea that God is good and God isn't a deceiver. So God's good, God isn't a deceiver. So how comes we sometimes have false beliefs? If God's a good guy and he's all powerful, surely he could make it that I never had any false beliefs. So what is the source of error? Yeah, you might think this is a kind of epistemic version, a theoretical version of the problem of evil. Yeah, if God is good, why is there evil? If God is good, why is there human error? How comes I don't know? How comes I have false judgments? Yeah, and Descartes' answer is that we've got these two faculties, the will and the intellect, and our will is infinite and our intellect is finite. And we can't blame God for giving us a finite intellect, because it's better that we exist than we don't exist. So creating us as finite, you can't blame God for that. And giving us an infinite will, you can't blame God for that either, because having an infinite will is good. And then when you put an infinite will together with a finite infinite, you get the possibility of error. That's basically the argument. Yeah. So the reason that the faculty of judging the truth, which he did give me, is not infinite, this is the explanation of error. And so this chapter is a discussion of error. So he says, investigating the nature of error, I realized that the possibility of error depend on two simultaneously operating causes: the faculty I possess of acquiring knowledge and the faculty of choosing or will. Yeah, so I've got these two different faculties, a knowing faculty and a willing faculty. Yeah, the faculty, a theoretical faculty and a practical faculty. Yeah, and of course, remember we looked at number one. This is precisely what Hegel's been attacking earlier in number four. The distinction between these two faculties is sort of set apart. Yeah, the practical faculty and the intellect are two aspects of one and the same faculty. So this sort of Cartesian picture, I think, is one of the enemies, one of the targets of Hegel's attack. So, and I can't complain for the fact that my faculty of knowledge, my intellect is limited. And this is the passage, one of the two passages I really wanted to focus on. Nor indeed can I complain that I have received from him an insufficiently wide-ranging and perfect will or freedom of choice. For I experience it as unbounded by any limits. My will is infinite. And it seems to me particularly important to note that there is no other property in me apart from this one that is so perfect or great that I cannot understand how it could be more perfect or great. So my will is unlimited. There's nothing greater than I can conceive of it. My will is in some sense perfect. This is crazy, yeah? It is only the will or freedom of choice that I experience in myself as so great that I can form the idea none greater. So if I can the idea of something perfect or infinite is something of which I can't have the idea of anything greater. So much so that it is chiefly on account of the will that I understand that I bear a certain image and likeness to God. So insofar as I have a will, I have freedom of choice. Insofar as I have a will, I am divine. This is what makes me like God and in the image of God. Because it's the only part of me that is infinite. Yeah? And so it's the most godlike part of me. When it is considered strictly, and as it is essentially in itself, this is about the human will. When I think about my own capacity of will, it does not seem to be greater in him than in me. My will is just as great as God's. Yeah, this is kind of quite strong stuff. This is because it consists purely in our ability to do or not do a given thing. That is, to affirm or deny something, pursue something or avoid it. So the will here is the sort of capacity to say yes or no. And in some sense, it's unlimited because it can be applied to anything. Now, there are some things that force us to assent to them. Yep, and no. Descartes doesn't think this is a limitation. Yeah, when we see through our intellect that something is true and we must assent to it, this is still an act of will and it doesn't limit the freedom of our will. Yeah, but we've got this conception of the will as this infinite capacity to affirm or deny anything that becomes before us. Yeah. So the cause of my errors is neither the God-given power of willing, considered in itself, for it is extremely extensive and perfect of its kind, nor the power of understanding. For whatever I understand, since my understanding is a gift of God, most certainly I understand it correctly, nor is there any possibility of my being deceived in this. So the origin of errors is that the range of the will is greater than that of the intellect. Yeah, why? Because anything that comes before me, I have the capacity to affirm or deny it. This is basically the idea. And I take it this is the sense, one of the targets, or one of the ways of thinking of the will as infinite and as indeterminate. Yeah. So I've talked a bit about the first aspect, the first way of thinking about the will as indeterminate, as the capacity just to affirm or deny, the capacity of reflection for anything that I take to be mine. So any desire I have, I can stand back and ask myself, do I affirm or deny this desire? So we might think that this capacity of abstraction is tied to the idea of reflection. We might think it's a second order sense of the self. We have desire, all animals have desires, but we're capable of standing back and making judgments about our desires, of affirming or denying them. We've got the capacity to question our desires. For any desire or belief I have, I can stand back and ask myself why. Yeah, this is the will this is the self or the will or the intellect as indeterminate, as infinite. Because whatever's given to me, I can stand back from it and ask why. And affirming this in its completeness, politically it involves the denial of anything given. In philosophy, we might think that the culmination of this aspect of the will is going to be something like an absolute skepticism. Yeah, we just refuse to accept anything that's given to us. Yeah, so we might think that kind of an absolute skeptic is someone who sees themselves purely from this sense, that they want to, in some sense, stand back from any particular content and refuse to endorse it. Yeah? They want to keep their freedom. They want to keep their indeterminacy. Whenever you believe something in particular, whenever you do something in particular, you've sort of become determinate. You've identified yourself with some particularity, with something finite. Yeah, and the sort of people who will this side of themselves are sort of in a sense unable or unwilling to accept the finitude of their own being. They want to identify with themselves as pure potentiality. Yeah, and so they're afraid of identifying with anything they've actually done, because this in some sense, or identify with anything they've actually created, any institutions they've created, because this is a limitation on their indeterminacy. So any questions about the will considered from this aspect? Because there's this other side as well.
In the Cartesian sense, can you account for the unconscious choices in any way? I think you cannot, but
yeah, I mean, so I think that for Descartes, yeah, the will is something mental, and the mark of the mental is consciousness. And so this capacity to choose is this idea of this sort of conscious commitment. And so I think in Descartes, there's no real room for this. I think for Hegel thinks that this idea of ourselves as free in this sense is itself an abstraction. Yeah, so this is a way we can think of ourselves. But when we think of ourselves in this way, we abstract from our sort of embodied embeddedness. Yeah. And so for Hegel, that this way of thinking of ourselves is an abstraction, and it's an important abstraction, and it's important that in some sense we keep thinking of ourselves in this way. So he doesn't want to, yep, but at the same time that he thinks that, yeah, it doesn't capture that because most of what we do because of our character. Yeah, we do as a result of the character we have, and our character is something that may have kind of, may have arrived partly through our education, partly through our free choices in the past, but our kind of actions are the result of the kind of willing of the whole person. Yeah, so I take it you might think what Hegel offers us is a sort of philosophy of the whole person. And then we have this idea of, and then we have these one-sided ways of thinking about ourselves that fail to grasp ourselves as we are as a whole, but are both aspects of what we are. Yeah, and so neither of them can capture fully what we are. So I think that in Descartes, it's difficult to think about anything like unconscious choices. I think ultimately for Hegel, when we kind of try and get what his big picture is, he does leave room for this, because the idea of the will as indeterminate, as free in this sense, as arbitrariness, this is an idea, I think, tied to consciousness and tied to kind of conscious control. But the idea that to identify who we are with this conscious control, that's a sort of one-sided mistake. And the people who do this become sort of fanatics. They either become fanatics of, the theoretical, which he ties to the sort of Buddhist mindfulness. Yeah, they either become fanatical yogaristas, or they become fascists. They become terrorists. They become people who, and they do this because they identify who they are with something like what's in their conscious control. So of what's in their conscious power to choose. And for Hegel, this is an important aspect of who we are, but we shouldn't fetishize it. Yeah, it's just an aspect of who we are, and part of it is that it's an aspect of who we are, and insofar it is an important part of who we are, it has to be incomplete, because the freedom to choose is always the freedom to choose something determinate. Yeah, and once we've made this choice, this sort of changes who we are. Yeah, part of what we are is what we've done. So I'm a being that exists in time. I've done a whole bunch of stuff throughout my life. And as I exist now in this moment, the future is open. I get to choose. Yep. But in some sense, I'm a being with a past. And I've got all these things I've done in the past. I've got all of these particular commitments I've made in the past that sort of limit my choices now. Yeah. You know, I've got a family. I've got friends. I've got a job. Yeah. That having a family, a friend, and jobs are not kind of, in some sense, givens that are outside of my freedom. Yeah. So it's, you know, it's not like there's something outside of me that is forcing me to do something, but they're sort of givens that I've say freely chosen in the past. Yeah. And so to fully identify with ourselves as potentiality, you might think this sort of sense of the self is the self looking into the future. It's the idea that the future is open. And that's partially, that's certainly part of who we are. But we're also beings with a past. And that's also part of who we are. We're beings in some sense who are projecting ourselves into the future. But we're beings that have a past, and the future is open. So we sort of make choices, and the choices we make about the future determine how we interpret our past. Yeah, so the past is given, but it's always open to reinterpretation. Yeah, it's not like a brick. Yeah, but the sort of person who identifies fully with this aspect of the self and thinks this is what it is to be an I, in some sense, all they really see is the possibility of making future choices. But the choices we make are always choices to determine ourselves. Whenever we make a choice between two options, there's one thing we choose not to do. There's a whole bunch of possibilities we cut off. So all freedom is a choice to do something determinate. It's always a choice of self-limitation, of self-determination, and the like. So this is number 5. This is the other aspect of choice. He says, in the same way, the I is the transition from undifferentiated indeterminacy to differentiation, determination, and the positing of a determinacy as a content and as object. Yeah. So here we've got the I as differentiated, as determined, as positing an object. So this is the kind of the I as objective. Yeah. And this content may further be given by nature, yeah, or generated by the concept of spirit. Now, I take it the sort of thought here is that, you know, all action is embedded action. It's always action in a context, and the context is the sort of backdrop or the given of any possible action. And the content may be given by nature. So I take it that I may have a certain type of body. Yeah, I may have, I've got arms and legs. I've got sexual organs. Yeah, so I have a body that has particular sexual organs. Yeah, but the content may be generated by the concept of spirit. So the given could be something that is sort of natural in the sense of first nature, or the content could be generated by the concept of spirit. Now, I take it there's two ways that the content, the given content may be generated by the concept of spirit. It may be done individually. So for example, I'm married to Zubaidi. We have a baby, Alijan. You know, I've made a bunch of choices in my life that mean that the choices I make now are in the context of certain commitments I already have. Yeah, so the content could be given by nature. I've got a particular type of body, there's gravity. These are things that kind of, these are part of the context of my freedom. I think the Hegelian idea is the idea that all freedom is situated. And the situation of my freedom, much of the situation of our freedom is itself generated by spirit, either by my individual choices about commitments I make, or through the sort of norms and institutions of the society I live in. So, for example, we find ourselves in a world with certain careers that are possibly there. We find ourselves in a world with certain types of gender norms and roles. These are sort of, these are content given, these are sort of a given content that has been generated by spirit. These are the results of free human activity. Some of the content we find is natural. Some of the content we find is sort of normative. We find ourselves with certain individual commitments based on our past choices, and we find ourselves occupying certain types of social roles that are governed by social norms. And of course, he's not claiming we have to accept these things. Yeah, but in some sense, this is the content that we find that when the first element comes into play, our freedom of open end, looking to the future, we have to take an attitude towards. Yeah. Through this positing of itself as something determinate, the I steps into existence in general. Yeah, and this is the absolute moment of the finitude or particularization of the I. Yeah, so we have the moment of the infinite, the I is the will as infinite, the capacity to affirm or deny, yeah, that is not limited. Anything that's given, I can kind of affirm or deny it. But then we also, and this in this Cartesian, this is, this is why I read the things from Descartes, that this other moment is the moment of finitude or particularization. Now, this is something that yeah, now we might think, what's the relationship between these two moments? And we might think that the first moment is sort of prior. So we might think that kind of we start off at pure potentiality, and potentiality then becomes actual. Yeah, so the sort of possible is prior to the actual. Yeah, so one way of thinking about these moments is, what's the relationship between possibility and existence, between the possible and the actual? Yeah, and one view is that the possible is prior to the actual. Yeah, or the existent in Hegel's terminology. Yeah, that you start off with the set of everything possible. Think about Leibniz's account of creation. God first of all thinks of all the possible worlds, and then brings into existence the best of all possible worlds. So first of all, the intellect works and thinks about what's possible. We have all the realm of possibility, and then there's the act of will, which chooses amongst all the possible worlds and makes one of them actual. So there's a kind of classical view in philosophy that takes possibility as prior to actuality. Yeah, you might think that existence is prior to possibility. You might think that you start off, all there is what's actual, and then you just define the possible in terms of possible ways of recombining what's possible. Hegel thinks that neither of them is primary. Both the idea of possibility and the idea of existence are abstractions. Both of these are abstractions. Now, he says this second moment of determination is just as much negativity and cancellation as the first. I take it the idea that both of these ways of thinking about ourselves are abstractions. So which makes sense as opposed to one another, and we shouldn't treat either of them as primary or fundamental. Yeah, so we might think that this moment is primary. So the first moment is primary, for it is the cancellation of the first abstract negativity. Just as the particular is in general contained within the universal, so in consequence is this second moment already contained within the first, and is a positing of what the first already is in itself. The first moment, that is, the first as it is for itself, is not true infinity. So the first moment contains the second moment in itself. Yeah, the self understood as this freedom, as pure arbitrary freedom, as kind of pure possibility, already contains actuality, existence within itself, because it's the freedom for something to become existence. Yeah, and so Hegel thinks that both of these moments are abstractions. And this is one of the major themes that runs through his whole philosophy, perhaps the major theme. Yeah, we have these dichotomies, and we take one or the other of them to be foundational. And we often find disputes in philosophy with philosophers dividing into two camps, with one camp taking one of them as foundational, the other one taking the other one as foundational. And the problem is that both of these sides are abstractions, and neither is foundational, or both are foundational. These are two aspects of an underlying reality that can't be, and we can't take either one of them as more basic than the other. They're mutually determining concepts that can only be understood together, and which one consider, if we take one of them as basic, then we end up with a sort of one-sided view. Often Hegel talks about the bad infinite. We have the finite and the infinite, and we have an abstract conception of the infinite, which is just the idea of the unlimited. And in some sense, the bad infinite is just the opposite of the finite. And so the bad infinite itself isn't infinite because it has something opposed to itself, the finite. The good infinite contains both the infinite and the finite. Yeah, it's all encompassing. It's absolute. Yeah. So he says the first moment, that is the first as it is for itself, is not true infinity or the concrete universality of the concept, but only something determinate and one-sided. Yeah. So the first moment, this idea of pure possibility, pure potentiality, we might think that we start off as possibility, then make a choice and become something actual. But I think this sort of idea in kind of Heideggerian terms, you might want to say that we're always already something determinate. Yeah, that the idea that possibility is prior to reality, the possible is prior to the actual. This is the kind of view that he's sort of attacking. But he doesn't want to go the other way either. He wants to say that they're both one-sided. Yeah. So this first idea, the idea of the self as pure possibility, as something indeterminate, as reflection, is only something determinate and one side, but only is not true infinity or the concrete universality of the concept, but only something determinate and one-sided. So we have this idea of being the infinite of the indeterminate, but this itself is another determination. This idea of the infinite is something finite because it's set up in opposition to the finite. So if we think of the infinite, the realm of pure possibility, in opposition to the finite, then what we're representing, Hegel thinks, is not something purely infinite, because there's something that it doesn't contain, the finite. For since it is abstraction for all determinacy, yeah, so this idea of pure freedom, of the will as abstract, is just abstraction from all determinacy. Yeah, so it starts off with something determinate and then it abstracts from it, reflects from it. But because it's a form of abstraction, because it's a form of reflection, it needs something to reflect on. There always has to be some object of reflection. It is not without determinacy. And the fact that it is abstract and one-sided constitutes its determinacy, deficiency, and finitude. Yeah, hold on, there's a bit of text missing here. Yeah, the differentiation and determination of the two moments referred to is to be found in the philosophy of Fichte and Kant. Except that in Fichte, to confine himself to his presentation, I as the unbounded is taken purely and simply as something positive. And so Hegel wants to overcome this dualism between the I as infinite, the idea of, and so he thinks that both Kant and Fichte have this idea that the first notion of the I is sort of primary. Yeah, the I of the autonomous I that gives universal law. And Kant thinks that the idea of giving universal law is an empty formalism because you can have no universal law without any content. In order to get universalizability, you need some content there. And the idea of the Kantian moral subject, Hegel thinks, abstracts from all content. But if you've abstracted from all content, all you've got is something purely abstract that doesn't have any content. So now, yeah, so now this second moment then, so this second moment appears as the opposing one. Yep, and it is too to be apprehended in its universal mode. It belongs to freedom, but does not constitute the whole of freedom. Yep. Here, through in actual real choice, the I emerges from undifferentiated indeterminacy to become differentiated, to posit something determinate as its content and object. Yeah, I do not merely will, I will something. Yeah, so willing doesn't just involve this abstract thing, but it involves willing subjects. A will, as described in the previous paragraph, will only the abstract universal. And because it wills only the abstract universal, it wills nothing, and is therefore not a will at all. Yep, so the Kantian moral subject, I think this is a sort of critique of the Kantian moral subject, wills universal law, but to will universal law is to will something abstract, and the abstract isn't real. And so a being that only wills something abstract wills nothing. Yeah, the particular thing which the will wills is a limitation. For the will, in order to be a will, must in some way limit itself. Yeah, the fact that the will wills something is the limit or negation. Thus particularization is what as a rule is called finitude. Now, reflexive thought usually regards the first moment, namely the indeterminate, as the absolute and higher moment, and conversely regards the limited as a mere negation of this indeterminacy. And this is the sort of idea that Hegel's sort of attacking in this discussion. The idea that the first moment is absolute and highest. We start off with pure possibility and then we will something actual. Yeah, but he thinks that this indeterminacy, the first moment, is itself merely a negation with regard to the determinant. Yep. So the idea of the finite determinate is a sort of limitation of the indeterminate, but the indeterminate is a sort of, or the possible is a sort of reaction to what's given. Yeah, so this indeterminacy, this capacity of choice, is merely a negation with regard to the determinate, to the finite. Yeah. Yeah, the indeterminate will is to this extent just as one-sided as that which exists in mere determinacy. Yeah, so both of these ways of thinking about ourselves are one-sided. Now, the third moment has got to do with this sort of this idea of the absolute. How to think both moments, how to think of ourselves in terms of both moments at the same time. So after the break, I want to talk about the third moment. Before talking about the third moment, though, I want to say something about how the second moment, so the first moment, thinking of the will as indeterminate, is the sort of the conception of themselves that we find amongst sort of, I think, radicals and revolutionaries and liberals, progressives. Yeah, the future is open. Here's my idea, let's bring it into action. Yeah, it's the idea of, first of all, it's the idea one has of oneself as a sort of, as a sort of Leibnizian God. I look at all the possibilities, and then I will the best of all possible worlds. Yeah, first of all, I survey the possibilities, and then I will what's best. This is the sort of moralistic view that starts with the first view. The second view is a view that kind of connects with a certain type of conservatism, because what the conservative does is sort of identifies with the with themselves as finite, as given. They identify themselves not with possibility, but with givenness, with objectivity. What Hegel sometimes calls, we might think the first moment is the moment of subjectivity, the second, the moment of objectivity. And that Hegel's idea of that we can identify ourselves as pure subjectivity. He thinks this is a form of nihilism. We can identify ourselves with pure objectivity, which is a form of unthinking conservatism. And then the answer, Hegel thinks, is to think that this dichotomy between subjective and objective needs to be overcome, and we shouldn't think in these dichotomous terms, and that we are essentially both objective and subjective. We're embodied embedded subjects. Yeah, I take it that's the sort of picture. So when we come back, I'm going to talk about section 26. So in section 26, he talks about the sort of conservative, and the objective self. And I think this is tied to the second moment. And then we'll look at his idea of the absolute will, and how Hegel thinks that we can't understand it to begin with now, but we can have a sort of felt representation of the will as absolute in the experience of love and friendship. Yeah, so in love and friendship, we don't think of ourselves either in the first way or the second way. In love and friendship, we sort of combine thinking of ourselves in these two ways. And so the feeling of love and the feeling of real friendship give us a kind of felt grasp of the absolute. But we can only come to think the absolute in politics and philosophy. And that's something we're not going to have a chance to do this semester, because you basically, if you want to think the absolute, you have to read the whole of Hegel. And that's not a task for the semester. Yeah. Love is all we need. Yeah. This is Hegel, I think. This is sort of hippie Hegel. Yeah. There is a bit of hippie Hegel. Yeah. He did like his wine. He used to drink like 2 or 3 bottles of wine a day, which I think is yeah. Here's what it is. Okay, 10 minutes break, and then we'll come back and talk about love and conservatism. Oops. Okay, I'm back. Okay, I'm back. I said I'll be back. Yeah. My Arnie Schwarzenegger. Hello, is there anyone out there? Okay. So let's try and oops, this is the wrong bit of Hegel. So I'm trying to share the screen. So we're trying to get to number 7. This is the idea of the sort of this two-sided view of will. Before getting to number 27, I want to see this kind of Hegelian sort of 3-step in operation again. So we keep seeing the same sort of move, but going on with different sort of contents, but we've got a similar sort of idea. And in number 25 and number 26, I think we get another way of thinking about this, about the will as subjective. Yeah. Then we have the idea of the will as totally objective, but the one-sided objective will. So we've got the so he says the subjective, as far as the will in general is concerned, denotes the will's self-conscious aspect, its individuality, as distinct from its concept, which it has being in itself. Yeah, so the subjective is tied together with the pure form. It's the absolute unity of the self-consciousness with itself. Yeah, this is, you might think of Kant's transcendental unity of apperception. This is Fichte's I equals I. It's the will as self-consciousness. It's will as the capacity to reflect. We've got the pure form. It's also the particularity of the will as arbitrariness. Yeah. And as the contingent content of whatever ends the will may pursue. So it's the idea of each one of us makes a choice about, we each have our own, to use their sort of Rawlsian terminology, we might think that we each have our own conception of the good, of what it is to have a good life in a modern pluralistic liberal society. So we got this kind of idea of the self understood in terms of subjectivity. Now, the will, the sort of picture he likes is the idea of what he calls the totally objective will. This is the idea of the objective will that contains subjectivity within itself. It's both subjective and objective. So he says the will, insofar as it has itself as its determination, so the will that wills itself, the free will that wills freedom, is a kind of totally objective will and is in conformity with its concept. So being in conformity with its concept is a good thing. If something's in conformity, that's the absolute. The absolute is in conformity with its concept, and the will, in the case of willing, what it is for a will to be completely in conformity with its concept is for the will to will itself. And the will willing itself is the idea of self-determination. But we've got a notion of objectivity yeah, which is tied together with this one-sidedness, yeah. So he says, but the will, in as much as it lacks the infinite form of self-consciousness, is the will immersed in its object or condition. And this is another form of sort of one-sidedness, whatever the content of the latter may be. Yeah, it is the will of the child. So the child has a will, but it has a one-sided will. It's immersed in the object. Yep, that it's a will that sort of lacks the infinite form of self-consciousness. It lacks a sort of independent conception of itself. As adult human beings who aren't slaves, we have a capacity to decide for ourselves what we value. We kind of have to, we sort of reflexively endorse our life plan. This isn't the case for the child. The child is just told, you know, it's dinner time now, it's breakfast time. Yeah, I went to a talk a while ago, quite a long time ago, actually, about 10 years ago. That was really fun. It was about modal concepts in preschoolers. So how do kind of 3-year-olds understand things like possible and impossible? And, you know, and they make a distinction between impossible but possible by magic. But one thing is they don't really distinguish between something being impossible and something not being allowed. So like, is it possible to go to school without breakfast? No, that's impossible. You know, that's just the way the world is. You know, you get up, you have breakfast, and then you go to school. Like, you know, like, yeah. So the child, for the child, just things that certain things are, everything's just determined from outside. Yeah. The ethical will, or the will of the slave. So we have the will of the slave. We have the superstitious will. Yeah, it's kind of Hegel at his most Kemalist. You know, the superstitious will is immersed in the object and has this one-sided. The superstitious will sort of lacks reflection. Yeah, and so this sort of objectivity, it's a one-sided form opposed to the subjective determination of the will. It's the immediacy of existence as external existence. Yeah, etc. Now, yeah, so like truly understood, the will is objective, but there's this notion of objectivity that opposes the objective to the subjective. And this, insofar as one identifies with this is the kind of will of a slave, the will of the kind of absolute conservative, the unreflexive conservative, the child. And I think Hegel thinks that there are some communities, some cultures that are in a sort of childhood state. So I think that this is his understanding of the ancient Greek world. That in the ancient Greek world, in some sense, the ancient Greeks didn't really have any subjectivity. They didn't have any inner life. They identified themselves purely in terms of their role within the community. And so if you look at his lectures on philosophical history, I take it he thinks that this mode of willing, yeah, this one-sided, this is more the kind of what you get in slaves, but also in pre-modern, in the ancient world. Yeah, so he has a kind of this very influential account of the Greek world as sort of lacking subjectivity, that the idea of subjectivity is a modern invention. The Greeks sort of didn't have any sort of private inner life. Everything was sort of public and the life of the community. I think this is probably almost certainly false as a historical claim. I think it's a sort of claim that's still sort of popular, I think, amongst Frenchies. Yeah, and so I think that the addition to number 26 is quite helpful. So he says, it is usually believed that the subjective and objective are firmly opposed to one another. Yeah, so we have these dichotomous ways of thinking. This is the kind of philosophy of the understanding that kind of sets off the objective against the subjective. And then you have some philosophers saying, oh, I want to start with subjectivity. Other philosophers saying, I want to start with objectivity. And you get these sort of dichotomies set up. But this is not the case. They, in fact, pass over into one another. For they are not abstract determinations like positive and negative, but already have a more concrete significance. If we first consider the term subjective, this may denote an end particular to a specific subject. In this sense, a very bad work of art, which does not fulfill its purpose, is purely subjective. Yeah, so a good novel is objective, but bad. Yeah, but the same term may also be applied to the content of the will, and then it is roughly synonymous with arbitrary. Yes, subjective content is one which belongs only to the subject. Thus, bad actions, for example, are merely subjective. But in addition, we also may describe as subjective that purely empty I, which has only itself as its object, and which possesses the power to abstract from any further content. Thus, subjectivity may have a wholly particular content, significance. So the first notions of subjectivity are ones that really are tied to something really particular, non-universal. Yeah, or it may mean something eminently justified, since everything which I am to recognize also has the task of becoming mine and gaining its validity in me. So this second sense, abstract sense of subjectivity, is a central part of, reflexive endorsement of one's life plans. This is going to be essential to the life of a free, self-determining human being. Yeah, but it's just going to be a moment in this life. Yeah, but then we have such is the infinite greed of subjectivity, which collects and consumes everything within this simple source of the pure I. Yeah, so in some sense, Hegel thinks that we set up these dichotomies like subjective and objective, and we see them as absolutely opposed to one another. But once we start poking around, we realize that the subjective presupposes the objective, and the objective is going to turn out also presupposes the subjective for various reasons. I think to understand that properly, you have to understand his philosophy of nature. Yeah, so that's not really part of the so much. He doesn't really justify this fully in the philosophy of right. And so the objective may be understood in no less varied ways. We may understand by everything that we make our object, whether such objects are actual existences or mere thoughts that we set up in oppositions to ourselves. But we also comprehend under objectivity the immediate existence in which the end is to be realized. Even if the end is wholly particular and subjective, we nevertheless call it objective as soon as it makes its appearance. So with the emergence of things like needs in a certain sense are subjective ends that are objective. But the objective will is also that in which truth is present. Thus, the will of God, the ethical will, is subjective. Finally, we may also describe as an objective the will which is completely immersed in its object. Yeah, so we have this sort of one-sided objectivity, such as the will of the child, which is founded on trust and lacks subjective freedom. Now, the sort of trick is how can we become adults and in some sense reflect critically on what's given? So, we might think, but keep some sort of trust. Yeah, we might think this is the kind of dialectic between skepticism and dogmatism in Kant. The dogmatist is like objectivity, is non-reflexive, is like the child. The skeptic basically isn't immersed. Yeah, they lack trust. Yeah, and I take it the kind of Hegelian thing is how can we keep this skepticism of philosophy, but also kind of have this trust? This is the sort of reconciliation with reality. And the will of the slave, which does not yet know itself as free, and is consequently a will with no will of its own. Yep. In this sense, every will whose actions are guided by an alien authority and which has not yet completed its infinite return into itself is objective. And I take it objective in this bad sense. Yeah. Every will whose actions are guided by an alien authority and which has not yet completed its infinite return into itself is objective. And this is, I think, a criticism. It's immersed in the object. I think this is Kant. You know, if you've read, who's read What is Enlightenment? Yeah, this is Hegel at his sort of most enlightenment. That you know, the motto of the Enlightenment is, for Kant, is think for yourself. You have to be your own authority. That you don't just take things on trust, but you ask yourself, is it true? Is it justified? You seek justification. Now, the problem with justification is whenever you have justification, you need some criteria. And the criteria is either something given or is itself in need of justification. So we've got this kind of problem with justification of infinite regress. And ultimately, Hegel thinks you can sort of solve this by appeal to a certain type of coherentism. Yeah, that we have certain criteria, you know, that the criteria end up justifying themselves, or they play a justificatory role, but then they themselves are justified by their place within the system. Yeah, so every will whose actions are guided by an alien authority and has not yet completed its infinite return into itself is objective. An objective in this one-sided way. The moment of subjectivity is the moment of being your own judge, of not needing alien authority. That's what it is to be an adult in Kant's account of enlightenment. To reach and to be enlightened is to be an adult, is to judge, is to think for yourself, is to make your own judgment, and to be guided by your own reason, not by the reason of another. I think Hegel's sort of very Kantian here, is that Hegel kind of says, but that's perfectly compatible with the idea that all reasoning is historically situated. Yeah, we can't just reason from nothing. I think, of course, Kant never thought we could. Okay, so let's get to number 7 then. So we've got these two different moments. And there's different ways, I think, of thinking about these two different moments. The universal and the particular, the infinite and the finite, the indeterminate and the determinate, the possible and the existent, the subjective and the objective, and the list goes on. However we want to think of it, whatever ways we have of characterizing this dichotomy, the will, the self, the I is the unity of these two moments. Now, from the perspective of the understanding then, the will contains something contradictory. The will can't be, the self-consciousness can't be fully understood. Because self-conscious is never fully what it is. Self-consciousness is always more than what it is, I think. So whenever you have a kind of determinate self-understanding, there's going to be something missing. So the will is the unity of these moments. Its particularity reflected into itself and thereby restored to universality. It is individuality. Now, one reason I put together Mill and Hegel is Hegel and Mill both start off with the idea of freedom, that Mill's book is called On Liberty. And Mill, of course, is very influenced by the Germans. So the University of Berlin, anyone know who founded the University of Berlin, where Hegel was professor of philosophy? Anyone done an Erasmus in Berlin? Or yes, it's now called the Humboldt University, and it was founded by William von Humboldt. And Humboldt, Mill dedicates on liberty to Humboldt, and he appeals to Humboldt in the chapters we're going to be looking at. And hey, Mill wants to justify freedom, political freedom, by an appeal to the value of individuality. Yeah, really, it's individuality what's central. And I think Mill has quite a kind of German-inspired understanding of what individuality is. And individuality for Mill, I think, like Hegel, is going to be something like a sort of situated freedom. And one of the things I think about Mill is that Mill is a sort of Aristotelian utilitarian who thinks that the good is happiness, but in some sense we don't know what's good for us. Yeah, we have to discover through life what's good for us, and we do that by engaging in what Mill calls experiments in living. Yeah, so basically, and we start off with a sort of tradition in which we're embedded. And this tradition in which we're embedded contains sort of useful knowledge about what's good for us. But this may not always be appropriate. Some of it may be corrupt. Some of it may be not applicable anymore today. Some of it may be limited. And so it's important to allow people experiments in living, to experiment in terms of discovering what it is to have a good life. Yeah, and this is something that we learn more about over time. So there is some sort of moral epistemic progress for Mill. So Mill is a utilitarian who thinks that we should strive for the good, but the good not something given, but the good for us as progressive beings. So we're the sort of beings that develop our understanding of what's good for us and what it is to lead a good life. Yeah, and so one reason we need freedom in society is so people can continue experimenting and discovering what it is to lead a good human life. This is kind of this is Mill's idea. And central to that is the idea of individuality. And it is the individuality. So the will is the unity of these both moments. The will is, and this is not something that we get. We only get real willing in the right type of community. We only get the possibility of real willing in a sort of liberal, modern, semi-liberal society. The will is the unity of both these moments, particularity reflected into itself, and thereby restored to universality. It is the individuality, the self-determination of the I, in that it posits itself as the negative of itself. That is, as determined and limited. So true willing involves positing oneself as determinate and limited, and at the same time remains with itself, by sich. So remaining with itself is, we have in itself, for itself, by itself. I take it remaining by itself is a sort of feeling at home with oneself. It's a sort of reconciliation with oneself. It's a kind of, the self is split, but there's no alienation. So that being by sich is to be in a situation where there's not this sense of alienation. That is in its identity with itself and universality. And in this determination, it joins together with itself alone. I determines itself insofar as it is the self-reference of negativity. Yeah, as this reference to itself. So it's the negativity is the limitation, and then it's the limiting itself. Is that the self-reference? It's limiting the limit. I don't know. As this reference to itself, it is likewise indifferent to this determinacy. It knows the latter as its own and as ideal, as mere possibility by which it is not restricted, but in which it finds itself merely because it posits itself in it. This is the freedom of the will, which constitutes the concept or substantiality of the will. It's gravity, just as gravity constitutes the substantiality of body. So this is kind of, this is true willing. This is, you know, this is will, successful willing. This is actual will, as opposed to some, this is healthy willing. If we take the Aristotelian idea, we might think that, you know, what it is to have a good life is to have a fully human life. And a fully human life is a life of rational activity. And when we have a lack of rational activity, we've got something like sickness or not something healthy. So we might think of this as healthy willing. Free willing is healthy willing. Now, this is Hegel speak. And, you know, he stood there in his class and he told his students this. He read out this stuff out aloud. And the students would be there being like, what on earth is, Hodja, what are you talking about? Well, here's his kind of lecture notes trying to explain this paragraph he's just given. Yeah. So once again, so he says, every self-consciousness knows itself as universal, as the possibility of abstracting from everything determinate. Yeah, so this is, what am I? What are you? I've got this, what I am as a thinking being involves this possibility of abstracting from everything determinate. But also, what am I? I am something particular with a determinate object, content, and end. So on the one hand, you're this possibility of making choices in the future. You're a being, I mean, you're both future looking and past looking. If I ask you who you are, you can identify yourself with this pure possibility. I've got these plans. Here are my, you know, or you can identify yourself with, you know, a particular determinate object. You've got particular desires. Yeah, so there's various ways we can think of ourselves. And every self-consciousness knows itself as both. But these two moments are only abstractions. What is concrete and true? So these two ways of thinking of yourself are both true, but they're only abstractions. What's concrete and true? And everything true is concrete. And now the students are like, yes, Hodja, tell us. And then he says, what is concrete and true is the universality which has the particular as its opposite, but this particular, through its reflection into itself, has been reconciled with the universal. That's it. That's, you know, that's. Hodja, what do you mean? Well, this unity is individuality. Yeah, so the will understood properly is individuality. So next class, we're going to be looking at Mill, and we're going to be looking at chapter 3 of On Liberty, which is on individuality, but not in its immediacy as a single unity, but as our common idea of individuality, but rather in accordance with the concept of individuality. I don't mean the idea of individuality you can understand. I mean the concept of individuality you can't understand. In other words, this individuality is in fact none other than the concept itself. Hold on. I thought you were telling us, yeah, what is this? Yeah, it's the concept itself. The first two moments, that the will can abstract from everything and that it is also determined, are easy to accept and grasp. Yeah. So we can understand, I can understand this thought of myself as abstract. I can understand this thought of myself as particular. These are easy to accept and grasp because they are in themselves moments of the understanding devoid of truth. That now they're abstractions. Yeah, they're things that can be understood conceptually by the understanding. And they're devoid of truth, not in terms of being false, but because real truth involves thinking, reason. Yeah, so he doesn't, by saying they're devoid of truth, he's not saying they're false. He's saying they're one-sided. But it is the third moment. Yeah, it is the third moment. The true and speculative. Speculative, you know, means talking about reason. And everything true insofar as it is comprehended can be thought of only speculatively. So truth is graspable by reason, which the understanding refuses to enter into. Because the concept is precisely what the understanding always describes as incomprehensible. Yeah. This unity of the particular and the universal, that's what we are, that's what's real, but it's incomprehensible. Now, Hegel is not a mystic. By saying it's incomprehensible, he's saying it can't be understood by the understanding. It can't be understood using fixed conceptual schemes because our concepts are sort of static, whereas the self is dynamic, it's something that exists in time. I think the idea is that when you're using conceptual understanding, you think of things statically, yeah, snapshots, but like dynamic temporal subjectivity, the things in time can't be fully grasped by using static concepts. Yeah. The task of providing and explaining in more detail this innermost insight of speculation, that is, infinity as self-referring negativity, this ultimate source of all activity, life and consciousness, belongs to the logic as purely speculative philosophy. So if you really want to understand this stuff, you've got to read my logic. So I'm not going to tell you very much about this, but the will is universal. So no, the only thing which remains to be noted. So basically, you have to read the whole of my philosophy to understand this. Yeah. The only thing that remains to be noted here is that when we say that the will is universal, that the will determines itself, we speak as if the will were already assumed to be a subject or substratum. So this is something he wants to reject. But the will is not complete and universal until it is determined. Yeah. It's not like, first of all, you have the will, and then this is something we're going to come across in Nietzsche, where Nietzsche kind of, you know, having the will standing behind the activity. It's a bit like saying the lightning flashes. It's not like you have the lightning and then the flash. The lightning is the flash. Yeah, the will is not a subject for Hegel standing behind willing. Yeah, that we speak as if the will determines to be a subject or a substratum, the subject of willing. You've got the will and then you've got the activity of the will. You've got will and then you've got willing. So the will wills. Hegel would say, no, that's not really how it is. In some sense, the activity of willing is prior. And it's through the activity of willing that we come to have a will. It's not that first of all we have a will and then we will. But the will comes into existence through the activity of willing. But the will is not complete and universal until it is determined. And until this determination is superseded and idealized, it does not become will until it is this self-mediating activity and this return into itself. So that's basically the story. At which point, Hegel's students in class were like, oh, Jeff, we've got no idea what you're talking about. Please, can you give us a hint? Can you kind of, please, oh, Jeff, please, could you just say something that makes sense? So Hegel's like, okay, like, I can't explain it to you because it's incomprehensible, but maybe you can feel it. Maybe I can give you a sort of aesthetic understanding. That's a kind of, you know, we have the aesthetic, the religious. In the final book of we have the aesthetic, the religious, and the philosophical. And the aesthetic is sort of one way of knowing. And Hegel's lectures on aesthetic are probably the most influential work on aesthetics in German after Kant. Well, maybe more so. So he's got some very interesting things to say about the aesthetic. He's got very famous stuff to talk about tragedy that was picked up on and rejected by Kierkegaard. So if you're interested in tragedy, Hegel's the place, one of the big starting points. But let me try and put this in English in a way that is understandable. So now he's trying to illustrate this in a way that you can get a felt grasp of what real willing is. But a proper philosophical grasp is going to involve you learning how to think contradiction, learning how to think speculatively rather than merely in terms of the understanding. So he says, okay, let me try and explain it to you. This is the kind of simplest. So what is properly called the will contains both the preceding moments. You have the infinite and the finite, the abstract and the indeterminate and the determinate, the possible and the existence. I, as such, is primarily pure activity. Aha. So rather than saying we've got the will and the will wills, we first of all have this idea of pure activity, sort of process. Yep. The universal which is with itself by C. But this universal determines itself, and to that extent is no longer with it itself, but posits itself as an other and ceases to be the universal. So, you know, I start off, you know, think about relationships. So think, I could be with anyone. I could be with that person, this person. Yeah, so you go there and there's lots of people you could be with. And you think of relationships in terms of pure possibility. That's really exciting. I could be with anyone. But in some sense, once you've decided on a particular course of action, on a particular relationship, in some sense, you've posit itself as another and ceases to be the universal. You know, I mean, just think of any decision. Like, you could go to the pub or you could do your homework. You decide to go to the pub instead of doing your homework, and you woke up the next morning with a hangover, and you've basically ceased to be, the possibility of doing your homework is no longer there. Yep, the possibility of going to the pub is no longer there. You've done it. You've ceased to be possibility. You've become something that exists. Yeah, that you no longer have the choice about what to have done in the past. Because we exist in time, when we act, we cut off possibilities. Things that were once possible are no longer possible. It ceases to be abstract. Yep. Now, sometimes we do this, and we find things that are kind of outside of ourselves that we reject, that are not, we consider as alien. And this, I mean, this could be a bunch of different things. It could be our body. You might regard your body as not right. So nature you might regard as, in some sense, alien. You might regard the sort of social norms as alien. There may be norms in your society that you can't live with, that you have to reject. You may have done things in the past that you're not proud of, yeah, that are part of who you are, that in some sense are alien to you, that you reject. Yeah. Now, so when you act, the sort of worry is that when you determine yourself that you're no longer in the realm of possibility, but you've done something and you've got to live with it, and it's no longer something that is freely chosen. Yep. So that you may look back, you can't change your past decisions. One aspect of this. Now, the third moment is that the I is with itself in its limitation, in this other. So the third moment, real willing, involves being with oneself within the limitation. As it determines itself, it nevertheless still remains with itself and does not cease to hold fast to the universal. This then is the concrete concept of freedom, whereas the two previous moments is found to be thoroughly abstract and one-sided. Now, we already possess this freedom in the form of feeling. So we have a sort of aesthetic feeling of what it's like to be free in this sense. For example, in friendship and love. Here we are not one-sidedly within ourselves, but willingly limit ourselves with reference to another, even while knowing ourselves in this limitation as ourselves. So real willing, real freedom involves willingly limiting ourselves with reference to another, even while knowing ourselves in this limitation as ourselves. So it's in love. In order to love someone, this person has to be other. They have to be distinct from you. But in some sense, you see them as part of you. You see them as both other and not other. Yeah. You see them, I can see you as you, but also as we. Yeah. Maybe when we take a we perspective. Now, in this determinacy, the human being should not feel determined. This is the feelings part of it. In love, in a loving relationship, in friendship, within the family. I think this is in ethical life. The first section of ethical life is on the family. And within the family, the idea is we have this sort of freedom. Yeah, where we feel determined, we're in a determinate relationship, but we willingly limit ourselves with reference to another, even while knowing ourselves in this limitation as ourselves. Yeah? Feeling at home. Yeah, so this overcoming alienation is a sort of feeling at home. And feeling at home is, I think, for Hegel, something that happens in the family. So the family is the sort of, I think, the institution of the family in the modern world. The sort of idea is that this gives us a sort of felt sense of freedom. He thinks that we only really get that sort of higher reflective sort of freedom within civil society. Yeah, so the family life isn't sufficient because it's felt, whereas we can have a sort of, yeah, we also need to feel at home within the civil society of the community in which we live. Yeah. So in this determinacy, the human being should not feel determined. On the contrary, he attains his self-awareness only by regarding the other as other. Yeah, so you can only really, in love, you have to regard the other as other. Yeah. Now, here, this idea of obtaining his self-awareness only by regarding the other as other, that ultimately within the phenomenology, we have this idea of the struggle for self-consciousness. And Hegel thinks that we can only really achieve self-consciousness, not individually, but within a society, through something like mutual recognition. And so real self-consciousness is only possible as mutual recognition. So I know you, knowing me, knowing you. You know that ABBA song? Knowing me, yeah. There's that very famous, do you know that English comedian who has that as his theme tune? What's it called? Steve Cogan. Oh, yeah, he has a very funny, if you like English comedy, what's it called? Steve Coogan. Oh yeah, I'm Alan Partridge. Yeah, if any of you get COVID and you're sort of want to watch some bad English comedy, yeah, yeah, it's sort of funny. He really likes this. This is one thing about him is he sort of lacks self-consciousness because he lacks the capacity for mutual recognition. But he likes this song, Knowing Me, Knowing You. That's why I was thinking of it. But yeah, that we obtain freedom. We obtain freedom through sort of mutual recognition. And this mutual recognition turns out only to be possible in the modern world, in a kind of free, sort of liberal society, because mutual recognition is only possible, real mutual recognition is only really possible in situations of freedom. I think Aristotle thought this. Aristotle thought that contemplation for human beings, because we're not gods, we can only do with others. We need friends. Yeah, so friendship is central to Aristotle. Book 9 of the Ethics is on friendship. And the reason it's so central is that the highest form of life is the life of contemplation, and the life of contemplation is a life we can only lead with friends. And so he has a discussion of friendship, and one of the things about friendship is you need a sort of equality. Yeah, without equality, you can't have real friendship, and you can't have real mutual recognition. If you have domination, you don't have mutual recognition. So you need sort of relationships of non-domination. Aristotle thought this was only really possible for a small aristocratic elite. I think Hegel thinks that really this mutual recognition has to be sort of practical. It's not just a matter of abstract reflection. It has to be a mutual recognition in sort of willing. So it's got to be a sort of, it's a practical analog of Aristotelian contemplation, and it requires friends. Yeah, we do it. So he attains his self-awareness only by regarding the other as other. You have to regard the other as other, but not alien. That's a sort of trick. Thus, freedom lies neither in indeterminacy nor indeterminacy, but in both at once. The will that limits itself exclusively to a this is the will of the stubborn person who considers himself unfree unless he has this will. But the will is not tied to something limited. On the contrary, it must proceed further. For the nature of the will is not this one-sidedness and restriction. Freedom is to will something determinate, but to be with oneself in this determinacy and return once more to the universal. So that's sort of Hegel on freedom. Hegel's sort of weird, and I really like Hegel. He's sort of fun. This is sort of Hegel messe I'm trying to give you. Next class, we'll start talking about Mill. We're a little bit behind on our schedule, but not a big deal. And Mill is a lot easier to read. He sort of makes sense. And I think we're going to find some very similar, we're going to find kind of some Hegelian themes. We're going to find, first of all, the value of freedom, about freedom in modernity. So we have this very modern notion of freedom, and the centrality of individuality, and the idea that the good, I think there's something important about the sort of semi-subjectivity of the good that we find in both of them. I think Mill's views, Mill is also trying to tread a middle ground between the sort of radicalism and conservatism. Okay, so I need to run because I need to go shopping before my next class. But I'll see you tomorrow, and bye-bye.